Edward VII was dying inside Buckingham Palace. His wife sat beside the bed doing what queens are trained to do: stay composed while the world collapses. Then the gates outside turned into a scene. A woman arrived in a rush. Not a doctor, not family, his mistress. Alice Keppel demanded to be let in, and she wasn't asking politely. She waved a letter from the king himself like a weapon. The guards hesitated, then opened the gates, because even dying, Edward's desires still had authority. And that one decision would turn his deathbed into his final scandal. But to understand why a royal mistress thought she could storm into the palace like she owned it, you have to understand the man who trained everyone around him to accept the unacceptable. Edward VII wasn't just a king, he was a lifestyle, a walking contradiction: charming, generous, and publicly lovable, while privately living like consequences were for other people. And here's the twist people forget: the Victorians weren't pure, they were just professional liars. Edward was born Albert Edward in 1841, raised in Buckingham Palace, and immediately treated like a project, not a child. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert wanted an heir who was disciplined, studious, and morally spotless. They got Bertie. He wasn't stupid, but he wasn't a little academic robot either. Tutors complained, his parents judged, and the harder they pushed, the more he learned one lesson: you can never truly win their approval. So he developed the only weapon that worked: charm. He could disarm a room. He could make people feel seen. He could make anyone laugh. And when you grow up starved of warmth, charm becomes a survival skill. Then, as a young man, he finally got a taste of something his parents couldn't control: freedom. Crowds adored him on tours. People cheered him. For once, he wasn't Victoria's disappointing son. He was the future king. And once that switch flipped, he used it on the one thing that always proves power: women. In 1861, the stories start getting ugly. One of the most infamous involves an actress named Nellie Clifton and a military camp in Ireland. Accounts differ, and the details have been debated for years, but the scandal's impact was real. Word reached Prince Albert. Albert, already ill, went to confront his son. He traveled, he reprimanded him, and soon after, Albert died. At the time, doctors blamed illness like typhoid. Later, historians argued over what really took him. But in Victoria's mind, the equation was simple and brutal. Bertie's immortality helped kill her husband. That grief hardened into something colder. Victoria didn't just mourn Albert, she punished Bertie for the rest of her life. You'd think a man blamed for his father's death would change. He didn't. He just learned to separate public image from private behavior. Because if the world is already calling you a disappointment, why not become the kind of disappointment you enjoy? In 1863, he married Princess Alexandra of Denmark. And by most accounts, Alexandra was graceful, loyal, and popular. Their marriage, on paper, looked stable. In reality, it became one of the most famous arrangements in royal history. Alexandra endured, and Edward wandered. This is where the nickname Dirty Bertie starts making sense. The sheer number of rumored mistresses attached to him over the decades is insane. Historians can confirm some names, suspect others, but the pattern never changes. Edward behaved like marriage applied to other people. And here's the part that makes it darker. He could afford it. Not just money, socially, politically. Because when a powerful man cheats, people call him rakish. When a woman is caught in the same scandal, she gets erased or destroyed. And one scandal proved exactly that. In the late 1860s, Edward was dragged into a divorce case that exploded in public. The Morden scandal. A husband claimed his wife had lovers, and Edward's name came up as a possible correspondent. Edward ended up testifying, which was extraordinary for the heir to the throne. He denied wrongdoing, and he walked away with his crown intact. But the woman at the center of it, she was labeled, judged, and hidden away. That's the Victorian system in one sentence. The man survives, the woman disappears. And Edward survived everything because people loved him, not in spite of his mess, but sometimes because of it. He was warm in public, approachable, the opposite of his mother's stiff morality. He shook hands, he joked, he made ordinary people feel important. So the country did what countries always do. They forgave the charming man and moralized the women around him. Then Edward almost died himself, and the public loved even more for it. In 1871, he came down with typhoid and nearly didn't make it. The nation panicked, because whatever his private life looked like, he still felt like their prince. He recovered, and the relief turned into devotion. That recovery could have been a turning point. Instead, it became proof in his mind that he was untouchable. And when a powerful man starts believing consequences don't apply to him, he doesn't become careful. He becomes bold. By the 1880s and 1890s, Edward's second home wasn't London. It was Paris. Not the postcard Paris, the night Paris. Clubs, high society salons, private rooms, expensive women, expensive food, expensive habits. And wrapped around it all was the great Victorian hypocrisy, public purity, private indulgence. This is where the legend of Edward's love chair is born. There's a famous story that a special chair was designed so Edward could enjoy, let's call it multiple companionship, without physical strain. People argue about how literal that story is. Some say it's exaggerated myth. But here's what matters. It sounds believable because the king's reputation is already that extreme. Edward didn't just want pleasure. He wanted spectacle. He wanted life to feel like a permanent after party where the rules stayed outside. But pleasure has a cost, and eventually it showed up in the only way Victorian society actually cared about: public embarrassment. Because sex scandals could be whispered, gambling scandals could be proven. In 1890, Edward got caught in the Tranby Croft baccarat scandal. Baccarat was illegal. The game turned ugly. A guest was accused of cheating. And suddenly, it wasn't gossip. It was court. Edward was called to testify. The heir to the throne dragged into a courtroom because of cards and ego. The verdict destroyed reputations around him, and Edward's image took a hit too. Here's the pattern again. Edward keeps walking. Other people get crushed. And then life punched him somewhere money and charm couldn't fix. His son, Prince Albert Victor, died in 1892. Young, sudden, shocking. Pneumonia during the influenza wave. Edward's letters showed real grief. For all his indulgence, he wasn't emotionless. He just hid emotions behind appetite. And that grief didn't end the indulgence. It changed the flavor of it. A few years later, Edward met Alice Keppel. And this relationship wasn't like a quick fling. It became a fixture. Alice was younger, socially skilled, and knew how to operate inside elite circles without embarrassing the man she attached herself to. She wasn't just a mistress. She was a professional calm, the kind of woman powerful men cling to when their own lives are chaos. Edward supported her quietly and strategically because he couldn't just hand her state money. So he used connections, opportunities, investments, the royal version of "don't worry, I'll take care of you." And in return, Alice gave him something he craved more than sex: comfort without judgment. That's why what happened at the palace gates later makes sense. She didn't see herself as a side story. She saw herself as part of the king's real life. Then the moment Victoria had dreaded arrived. In 1901, Queen Victoria died, and the man she spent decades treating like a failure became king, Edward VII. At 60 years old, after a lifetime of being the heir, he finally got the crown. And here's the annoying part for his haters. He wasn't terrible at it. Edward had political instincts. He was a social operator. He understood diplomacy because he'd spent decades reading rooms. He brought a lighter energy after Victoria's long mourning era. The country exhaled. But he did not become a monk. He carried his private life with him into kingship. Because why would he stop now? He had been rewarded his whole life for refusing to stop. And then his health began to collapse. Years of heavy eating, heavy drinking, heavy everything. By 1909 and 1910, the king was visibly failing. And that's when the empire discovered the final truth about Dirty Bertie. When Edward started dying, the palace tried to control the narrative. They always do, because monarchy isn't just family. It's brand management with crowns. Alexandra, his wife, stayed in position, dignified, silent, publicly flawless. The queen who swallowed humiliation for decades and still did her duty at the end. Meanwhile, outside those walls, Alice Keppel refused to accept her assigned role, the hidden woman who disappears when it's inconvenient. She showed up at Buckingham Palace like she belonged there. She had a letter from Edward, proof in ink that the king wanted her near. And the guards, because humans love obeying paper, let her in. But what happened next is why the story still spreads. Inside the palace, the queen found out, and Alexandra, the same woman who tolerated years of affairs, finally drew the line. Because it wasn't about jealousy anymore. It was about power, about respect, about who gets to stand beside the king when the story ends. Alice Keppel made a scene. Accounts vary on the details, but the result is consistent across retellings. She overstepped, and she was removed, escorted out, humiliated, thrown back outside the gates like she'd never mattered. That's the bill coming due. Not for Edward, for her. Edward died on May 6, 1910, and the country mourned him intensely. Hundreds of thousands filed past his coffin to pay respects. He became a beloved king in death, because death cleans reputations. It turns consequences into footnotes. And the sharpest irony, the woman in his orbit carried the shame while he carried the legend. Alexandra became the dignified widow. Alice became the woman who tried to claim a dying man and got punished for it. And Edward became the charming rogue king people talk about like he was a fun story. But this isn't just tea. This is a blueprint of how power works. A man with status can build a private life that breaks rules because the system is designed to protect him. And everyone around him learns to negotiate their own dignity just to survive being near him. Edward VII lived like he could outrun consequences. In one sense, he did. He got the crown, he got the applause, he got the legacy. But his final scene exposed the truth. Even the king's mistress wasn't safe from the rules when the king himself was no longer there to protect her. Because when the powerful man dies, the world suddenly remembers who's allowed to matter. That's why the gate story sticks. It's not romantic, it's not a love story. It's a hierarchy snapping back into place. Edward gets the state's funeral. His wife gets history's honor. His mistress gets the door. And if you think this is just ancient drama, here's the part that makes modern audiences choke. Alice Keppel's legacy didn't vanish. Her family line ran forward into British high society. And yes, it's often noted that Queen Camilla is descended from Keppel's line. So even after the mistress was removed, the story didn't end. It just evolved. Because royal history is basically one long cycle of indulgence, denial, and inheritance. Edward VII wasn't England's most debaucherous king because he had affairs. Plenty of royals had affairs. He was the most debaucherous because he turned indulgence into a lifestyle and made everyone around him absorb the fallout quietly. And the night he died, for a few minutes at Buckingham Palace, the quiet broke. A mistress tried to rewrite her place in the story, and the palace reminded her exactly what she was. If you want more stories where the legend is the mask and the real damage happens in private, subscribe. Because history doesn't just create kings, it creates survivors who learn to bleed in silence.